All right, if you could tell me first of all where you were born and when you were born.
Yeah. Now, well, I was February 1925, so that makes me 74 years of age at the present time.
And where were you born?
I was born in the village of St.Ives, just across the road from here, and I've lived in this house now for 60 years. So I don't intend to move on just now.
How did you get into mining? Was it anybody in your family?
Well, no. Well, yes, there was. My father, he did mining in his younger years, and then he went. The tin was in depression. He went to South Wales, and he did a term of coal mining, and then he came back, and then he became a greengrocer in the village, which he was up to his retirement. Of course, when I reached the age of 18, the war was in progress, and I had to either to go in the forces, which I contemplated going into the Navy. And I actually had my call-up papers to go to Devonport, and during the week that I was going at the end of the week, in the middle of the week, I had this letter from the Ministry of Employment stating that I could go either coal mining or tin mining instead of going into the armed forces. Well, at the time, my uncle, who was in the Navy, was home on leave, and I spoke to him about it, and he said to me, "You just go mining, my boy." He said, "It's a very dangerous job in the Royal Navy at the time of war." So that's really how I came to be going to be a tin miner for the 2 years that I was at Eastpool.
Mm-hmm. Can you remember what your first day was like at Eastpool then?
Yes, I can vividly. We were equipped with a hard hat and a lamp which was operated with carbide, which you put water onto the carbide and it produced a gas, and then you had your light. So I think that I'm not too sure of what it cost me at the time, but it wasn't very much money, but it was a lot in those days. And I remember my first episode of going down the shaft, because it was a great joke with the winder, the chap that was in control of the engine to let the men down the shaft. If there was any new boys on that morning, normally it would go down at a steady pace, but if there's any new boys on, he would drop you down like a stone. And of course that was, I didn't like that too much at all. But and we reached 1,700 feet underground, and that was my first introduction of tin mining, and I wasn't too happy about it.
What did you? What was your first impression then? You thought you'd probably been better off in the Navy after all.
Well, I mean, we were given we were told to go with experienced miners, and my first job was to go with a gang of about 6 chaps, and we were developing, which means that we were driving tunnels. And we would drive a tunnel through the load of tin, and then they would develop that going upwards. The object of mining is going down, drive a tunnel, and then go up and extract the ore from the loads. That's the prime object of tin mining. So that was my first job, was developing and driving tunnels, which was very hard work. We had artificial air, and the place was dusty and very hot, and we had to do an 8-hour shift, and we had about an hour for our lunch, and then about an hour before finishing work we had to put dynamite in the holes that we had drilled, and blast them an hour before we leave the place of employment. Of course, if we were on a day shift, we would start at 7 and we would come up at 3. Then the next shift would go down at 3, and they were back in to the place that we had just come out of. The place would be full of smoke and dust, and they would be back in working, which was very injurious to your health. And they certainly took in a lot of dust. And well, I'm afraid some of the boys are not around now that I work with. Well, I know, and there's a lot of the young fellas that I work with. The boys are passed on, but I'm lucky enough that I'm still here to tell the tale.
I didn't realise that the dust was so injurious to health. I didn't realise it was quite so serious in the tin mines.
Yes, it is. It is. They get into your lungs and cut your lungs up. But the only thing it's left me is I am breathless, and that's the only. But I can get by with medical aid. There was another, and then there was another instance I recall. We were about 4 chaps were up in a stope, which was, as I explained before, we were going upwards and extracting the ore, and we had to climb a ladder about 80 feet. We were nearly to the top, and I remember carrying a packet of dynamite, and I got halfway up and I dropped it. And I was expecting some big, horrendous explosion. But as you know, dynamite won't explode unless it's in a confined space. So nothing really happened. But I was very frightened at the time, because I wasn't down there more than a few days, and this is what it comes back to me. And we had to climb ladders of, well, they were sections of ladders, and we were 80 feet. The total length of these ladders was about 80 feet. And then we had to do a day's work. And we had to drill about 8 or 10 holes. Well, 8 holes, I suppose. Which would take roughly about an hour to drill. And of course, I was the boy. And I had to start the hole off. You had to sort of hold the drill in your hand up to the face to start the hole. With the machine man would be behind you controlling the machine, and of course that's the time when you would take in a lot of dust starting the hole. But once it started, it was okay. You could get a succession of longer drills, and you would put in a 6-foot hole. And at the end of the shift you would pack it with dynamite, and of course you'd blast it down, and that was another job that I did. And then I had a job. We were sinking instead of raising. We were going down to another level, and I was put on that particular job, and we got about 30 or 40 feet down, and the chaps they had a bucket, they would put the rocks in the bucket, and at the next level up there would be a machine which pull this bucket out on a wire rope. But my job was to stand halfway in this shaft, with about 30 feet drop below me, stand on a section of the shaft timbers, catching hold with one hand, and as the bucket was coming up, I would guide the bucket through quite a narrow space to make sure it didn't catch under the timbers. So I stood there for 8 hours, catching hold with one hand and guiding the bucket through, full of rocks, to the next level to be taken up. And I can tell you that wasn't a very pleasant job, with the water coming down on top of you, and I was glad when that job actually finished. That's the last job that I was on. And then of course Eastpool at that time was getting pretty rocky. They were thinking about closing, and a number of us were sent to Scotland, where we went up to in a clay mine, which this particular company were making bricks, a brick company, and they had us in mind to extract the clay to make the bricks. And a local boy was with me, and we were we were billeted in a hostel, and that is where I met my wife. So there is some good that came out of it, and that's about the only good that I think about tin mining. It's not a very nice job, but of course some people, they made their lives. They were dedicated to mining, but I'm afraid I'm not one of those.
Can you say a bit more about when you climb the top of these ladders, and then how much space are you working in when you're trying to drill these holes? Then, I mean, what are you standing on the rock, or are you on a platform?
Oh yeah, well, going back to when we got to the top of the 80-foot ladder, where we working in a space of about, let me see now. I would think it would be about 8 foot high, and it could be 20 paces long, and you would to rig your machine up, you would have a big long bar, which would you could something like a jack, which you would extend to the roof and to the bottom, and you would have wood wedges at the bottom and wood wedges up the top to secure it. And on this long bar, you would have an arm, and then the machine would be placed on the arm, and which you could direct it at the face to use to put the holes, to drill your holes, and that is how we progressed for 8 hours, with about an hour. Well, I don't think we had an hour's break in that time, but like I said, we finished an hour before we had time to leave work to charge the holes up. Excuse me.
Can you describe? You're just describing the drill and the bar and
all. I think that's another thing that just sort of comes back to me. As you know, the East Pool mine was, I don't know exactly the age of Taylor's Shaft, or the age of the mine, I don't really know, but I do know that the equipment they had in that mine was it was on its last legs. And very often the pumps, not the main pump, but the pumps that in what we would call a winch, which would be he would go down the main shaft, walk half a mile, and then go down another 100 feet, and they would have small pumps for pumping the water down there. But those pumps would frequently break down. Of course, once the pump stopped, the water would just rise dramatically. So they would have a mechanic fixing the pumps, and of course he would get it going. But the last 2 feet of water, they couldn't wait until they pumped the last drop out. They would drop you down into this water, and many a time, I can remember it vividly, the water would come up past my waist before I had to do a day's work after that. But the water was warm, so it wasn't it wasn't dramatic. It was warm, and but nevertheless, we had water coming up to our waist, and even higher. I've been dropped into water. They just couldn't wait to get the last drop out. So that's not a very nice thing to happen to you in your initiation as a tin miner. But I worked for 2 years, so I don't really call myself a tin miner. I think you've got to be down there a lot longer than 2 years to be a tin miner. But that's just one or two of my experiences, of course. And when we come up of course, if we were on afternoon shift, when we come up about 11 o'clock at night. We would come from a very hot place, and it could be in the winter time. We would, as we were getting near the surface, we could feel the cold air coming down, and we would make a dash for where we had our clothes hanging up to have a shower and have a hot shower, and which we did in those days. And I'm talking about over 50 years ago, and we had hot showers at that particular time. So it wasn't all that antiquated.
What was it like on the surface? I mean, what sort of buildings and so forth was there? Would be the dry?
Well, the dry, yes. The dry was, it was a big long building, and there was chains. Each person that was working in underground had a chain with hooks on it, and you would when you would in the mornings you would take your normal clothes off and put on your underground clothes, and then you would pull the chain up to the roof, and the hot air would rise. Well, yes, because your clothes when you come from up underground, your clothes are soaking wet. So by the time your next shift, they would be dry because it was the heat rising, and well, I'm afraid there was quite a few fleas around, and they were quite numerous. We had a few bites.
So, you biked from here over to Eastpool, did you?
I had a motorbike.
Oh,
it was in the war years. Yeah, of course, petrol was rationed, and if it was at night time, if we went out, we would have a mask put on the front of your headlight with 3 slits in the mask for your light, so they wouldn't be seen by enemy aircraft. And I had a motorbike, and of course I was only 18, and I was a bit adventurous. So I remember we was night shift, and in the morning one chap said to me, he was a fairly elderly fellow, and he said, "Do you mind giving me a ride home to Redruth, Ron?" I said, "No." I said, "Yeah, fine." So I said, "Jump on the back." So in the middle of the way home from Redruth, there was a roundabout which we had to go around. Well, at 7 o'clock in the morning, things was very quiet, so instead of going around the roundabout, I went straight on, you see. And so we got into Redruth town clock, and he says to me, "Well, Ron," he said, "that's the first ride I've had with you, and it's going to be the last one as well." So I think I gave him a bit of a scare.
How did you manage to afford to run a motorbike then? Because the wages weren't that
Well,
fantastic.
the pay was 11 shillings a day, and if we were allowed one day off we could miss one shift in a month. If we missed 2 shifts, we would lose our bonus to £6. So we made sure we didn't lose two shifts. But we were paid 11 shillings a day. So that's for 5 day week. So it's not a lot of money. But even so, we managed, because, well, as you know, that things were far different than what they are today. A shilling was we could buy something with a shilling. Food was reasonably cheap, and my dad used to he had, like I said, he had a greengrocers around, and he used to keep a pig or two during the war. And I remember we used to kill a pig. Well, we had a permit to kill 2 pigs a year, and of course 2 pigs sometimes went to 3. So one was unofficial. I don't think that actual Cornish people, they weren't so hard pushed as the city people were. We always managed to have a little bit extra.
Yeah. Did you have any evacuees at all then?
Yes, my mother and father, they were host to a family from London. There's a lady and her 2 children came down, and they stayed with us for about 12 months. And her husband used to come down on holidays, but he had to go back and for his employment. But they lived with us, and as a matter of fact, my mother and father's passed on, but they kept in touch with them, and we've got some photographs here knocking around now of when the people went back. They thought of my mother and father, and they thought highly of them, and some wedding photographs of their children they sent down to my mother and father, and like I say, we still got them here, and They enjoyed it. They enjoyed the country life, and they've never. I don't think they ever seen a field of grass until they came down here. But it's just they came away from the horrific things that was happening in London.
What was the village like at that time? Had you got mains
Well,
water
well,
and mains electricity?
Well, Sunday, we had no water supply, and we also had no sewage. So you can imagine all the WCs were all dry toilets, and the water used to come around in a barrel, and we used to buy our water at a penny a bucket. And the chap that sold the water used to fill up his cask down at the water chute that came from one of the old mines that were closed down, and the water used to come down through the ground. It used to come out in an iron pipe, and he used to fill the cask up with water and come around us Sunday, and he sold it at a penny a bucket. So that's a thing for people don't know too much about today.
What was the water like? Was it?
It was
very acidic.
Beautiful water. And sometimes today I go down there and I get a bottle of water and I put it in the fridge, and it's beautiful water. It's far better than what you can get out your tap today.
Yeah.
There's no additives to it. It's straight from the ground. This here water is still running after all those years. Wonderful.
But did you say that there was electricity, mains electricity at that stage, or not?
Yes, there was electricity. Yes, there was electricity. Yes, and compressed air, compressors and things like that. Yeah. But it's another thing I recall. Is just come to me about these machines that we were using for drilling holes. We used to take a big can of oil with us. Of course, these machines after a little while used to get hot and they would refuse to work. So we would take off the air hose and put about 2 pints of oil down the air hose and then fasten it up again to the machine and of course give it a blast, and this here's place would be full of oil. Little did we know that we were breathing this oil in, you see, and we did that 3 or 4 times on a shift. That's one of the things, the hazards of mining. But today they've got different machinery altogether, and we had no extractors. There were no extractors in those days. It was just the people that worked in the shaft. They were afflicted with the dust, and they didn't do any mining at all. But they just simply worked in the shaft all their lives, and they were afflicted with dust which got into their lungs. It's very fine dust, and it's silica dust which is very sharp, and it cuts into your lungs. But I didn't like the job at all, to tell you the truth. The quicker I got out of it, the better. And but however, I mean, we had to stay there, and of course, like I said, I went to Scotland, and I did 12 months in Scotland in this brickworks or clay mine, and that was totally different. In tin mining, the tin load goes horizontally through the earth, but in Scotland it was hard clay, not soft clay. It was hard clay, and that there's a flat seam. So it was a different method altogether than tin mining. They even blast it with gunpowder, because if they used dynamite, they would have smashed it to pieces. It wouldn't be any good at all. And so, it was all right. I mean, that's where they sent us, and we had to go. And we went. I remember we got on the train in Redruth, and we couldn't find a seat on the train, so we sat on our suitcases until we got to Paddington. And we went across to King's Cross, and we thought, well, perhaps surely we'll get a seat. And the same thing happened there. We couldn't get a seat. We went from King's Cross to Edinburgh, and we sat on our cases in the corridors for the remainder of the journey. I can tell you, when we arrived in Edinburgh, of course, it was like a different world there. Everybody was speaking different to we boys that come from Cornwall. So we had to ask 3 or 4 times what they were talking about.
So when did you finish in Scotland then? Was it the end of the war anyway?
No, my mother was taken ill, and I had a telegram to say that she wasn't expected to live, and I asked the management could I go home to see her, and of course they gave me a letter of leave. Well, they gave me a letter of temporary leave with no notification when I had to go back. So I thought, well, I think I'll stay on I'll stay on for a little while longer. So I never did go back. And one day I had a big letter from the Ministry of Employment saying that come to our notice that if you've left your employment without permission, and which was very serious. And they wanted to interview me, and of course I went in for the interview. And there was 3. I thought they were judges there. They were going to send me to prison or something. So they laid down the law to me before they started, and I let them go for a little while. Then I said, well, perhaps you'd like to have a look at this letter, good job I kept, which stated I was granted temporary leave of absence from my employment, and of course that there was nothing more was made of it. But 3 months after that interview, I was in the forces, and I went into the army. I was in the army for 2 years. Yeah. Of course, but the war was at an end then, just at the end of the war. So eventually I did go in the armed forces. But that's a little bit of in between, you know.
Well, how did that compare with the mining after all then?
Well, I had a wonderful time in the army. And I went to Germany, and I had 12 months in Germany. And of course we were occupation forces, and I had a good job. I was in military police, and which were too popular with the British soldiers. But I recommend the forces for any young man that wants to make a career. And I tried to get my grandson to join the forces, but I don't think he would like the discipline. But we only had discipline for the first 6 or 8 weeks, and after that it came easy. And,
so you never went back to mining?
No, I did not go back to mining. When I came out of the forces, I decided I had a little small holding, and I decided to go that way. And I think the people that want the tin, I think they're the best people to go down and extract it themselves, because you won't get meat in there anymore. But saying that, with these modern machinery now, and the ventilation is different. You got big extractors to take out the dust, and it's far different. We were working in antiquated conditions. You know, they were always the big main pumping shaft. It would break down, and it was continually breaking down, because it had a tremendous amount of work to get all that water from the main shaft. There's millions of gallons of water every day that comes out of that. And, it is, but it's the sort of thing that gets into your blood when you leave the surface on a real cold day, and then when you go down, it's nice and warm. Then when you get in further, it gets hotter and hotter and hotter. And when you come to your work and your place where you were doing your work, it was really, really hot. Until you got your air on for your machine, and once you got that going, it was bearable. Yeah, you know. But I remember we were working in this particular stope. Of course, after you go into the stope, the first thing you do is take a long iron bar and tap the roof for any rocks that is just about ready to fall. You could, by tapping the roof, you could tell with the sound of the bar whether it was shallow or any crevices or cracks. And if you could detect it. But they wouldn't let the boys do that. The experienced men would use the bar, and they could detect if there was a crack, and they would just get the bar into a little lever and lever it down, and a piece of rock would come down about half a ton. It would come down right in front of you. But then you clear your roof, of course, and then, like I said, up goes your pole. Then you would start work. But that was the first thing we had to do, is to make sure the roof was safe before we. But there have been accidents. I mean, there were things they might have missed, or the crack appeared after they started to work, and things like that. There's been many accidents. Many accidents.
Is that what they call barring down then?
That's barring down. Yeah.
What's what are chutes?
Now a chute is, like I said, we were developing and driving a tunnel, and after you drive through the load, they would put up like if a load was, say, 12 feet in width, which was extraordinary for. I just taken 12 feet for an example. They would drive 4 holes, which they would call raises. They would drive a hole up. They would, in the whole length of the load, they would drive 4 holes up, and then they would once they drive them up, they would go up about 20 feet, and then they would drive a tunnel linking those 4 holes up. So those 4 holes were each one, they would have a chute attached to them, which the timbermen, what we used to call it, come down and they would construct a chute, which would be sort of a, how can I describe it? It's it would be about 6 foot long. Well, if it was 12, it would be 4 foot long. And they would put timbers 3/4 of the way up into the holes that had been excavated, and a quarter would be extended out, so that they would just catch the trawlers that used to come in. That they would come down and fill the trawlers up through the chutes, and at the end of the chutes would be two long pieces of wood, which they could manoeuvre. We could lift up and let the ore come out at the bottom, and if they wanted to stop it running, they just drop the timbers down, and that would close it off, and that's how that was operated. So they could have had. All depends on the width of the load. You see, they could have 3 chutes in, or they could have, if it was a small, they'd have 2 chutes. You see, and they would put these huge timbers in, which they would cut what we call hitches to drop the timber down in these niches in the walls, and they were secure. They wouldn't move. And sometimes if a big rock came down, of course these rocks that came down is what we had been up in the stope breaking. You see, and they come down and comes out. If a big one came down, like so, I just had a big lump of rock, half a ton come down. Well, they would have to use dynamite to break it up, because he wouldn't come down. He wouldn't go out through the chute. You see. And.
So what sort of angle is the chute at then? Almost vertical, or is it a slight?
Yeah, well, it's just like yes. It's not, well, it's just about like that sort of thing. It would just be under the lip as the ore come down. See, you when you're up in a stope and you break your holes, break your ground. Now you wouldn't have room to work if that was left as it fell. So you'd have to take away some ore from the bottom before you would have room to rig up your bar to start work again. So they have to take away a certain amount before you could have room to operate again. So that you would say, I want three wagon load or 4 wagon load taken away. So it gives you room to operate. And that was the system. Yeah. But it used to work, and there's some very good men.
I'm just taping.